Right friends, welcome back to Insight. This is 16th week. We are going to deliberate 3 issues. The first one is bank deposit growth slowed to 5-decade low of 9.7% in 2015-16. Bank deposit growth was around 9% in 1960s. Now it reached that level. And second one is in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is the king. This is the statement uttered by Raghuram Rajan, and we are going to deliberate whether the economy is really growing at 7 to 7.5% or not, and what is the inner meaning of Raghuram Rajan's comment. Africa is suffering because of tumbling commodity prices, because of lack of diversification in economies in Africa. Several African countries are badly suffering, like South Africa, like Nigeria, and we are going to deliberate on this issue also in this week's Insight. Look at the first one. Bank deposit growth slowed to 5-decade low of 9.7% in 2015-16. During 1960s, bank deposits have grown at around 9 to 10%. Subsequently, the bank deposit growth is always more than 10%, and during the period around 2008 to 2013-14, bank deposits growth was around 15 to 18%. And as a thumb rule, when the GDP is growing at 7 to 7.5%, normally the credit growth or deposit growth is expected to be around 2.5 times of that. As the conventional bankers say, the deposit growth or credit growth is normally expected to be 2.5 times the GDP growth. Our GDP figures are around 7 to 7.5%. So if you multiply it by 2.5, then it comes to around 17-18%. So logically, if the GDP is growing at around 7 to 7.5%, the credit growth as well as deposits growth is expected to be around 17 to 18%. But you see the irony for 2015-16, the credit growth was 10 to 11% and deposits growth was 9 to 10%. This casts doubt on the real GDP figures in this country for the past 1 or 2 years. After the change in methodology, several experts expressed their concern with regard to the real growth in our country, and macroeconomic indicators are not reflecting it. We are going to deliberate on it when we are discussing the second issue of today's Insight. But during the first issue, let us look at what are the reasons for poor deposit growth as well as poor credit growth. In the banking system, what are the reasons for poor deposit growth? Diversion to small savings instruments because of interest arbitrage. You may ask, what is arbitrage? That is basically difference in interest rates here. Small savings interest rates are higher than the bank deposit interest rates. That may be one reason. The difference in interest rates is known as interest arbitrage. So, diversion to small savings instruments because of interest arbitrage, that is one reason. Second one is diversion to acquire physical assets. People may be showing interest in acquiring physical assets like real estate. And third one is more consumption expenditure with less savings. The biggest problem now the country is facing is consumption expenditure is increasing and savings are reducing. When the consumption expenditure is increasing, then what will happen? And naturally, bank deposits will also reduce. Then savings in other financial instruments such as mutual funds. And because of the 2 consecutive drought years, the rural distress is evident, and surplus in rural areas may not be much because of 2 consecutive years of drought. So, primary factors for reduction in deposits growth is more consumption expenditure, diversion of surplus money towards real estate, and investments in some financial instruments like shares, mutual funds, debentures, right? And when you look at the reasons for poor credit growth in the banking sector, the credit growth is around 10 to 11%. And if you compare it with the GDP, it should be somewhere around 17 to 18%. If you analyze the reasons for poor credit growth The biggest problem the companies are facing today is companies are already into problems with high debt equity ratio. The debt equity ratio is one of the highest for companies in our country. You may ask, what is the debt equity ratio? If the company has got its own funds of 100 crores, when they borrow 200 crores, let me tell you once again, when the company has got its own money of 100 crores as equity, if it is borrowing 200 crores, then the debt equity ratio will be 200 by 100, it will be 2. So, the debt equity ratio for our companies is very high. Second is, some companies are not able to service their debt, which resulted in high gross non-performing assets. What is meant by servicing of debt? When corporates borrowed money, they have to pay back normally every month to the banking system. When the companies are not able to pay back money to the banking system, then they are not able to service the debt. And when they are not able to service the debt for more than 90 days, it becomes a non-performing asset, and public sector banks are facing non-performing assets as the biggest problem in recent years. Then the capacity utilization of Indian companies is low, and it is putting further strain on companies. Then there is not much demand for goods and services. This is the reason why capacity utilization is low. Then use of mostly imported electronic goods is one of the reason why the manufacturing of electronic sector is not taking off on expected lines. So, these are the reasons for poor deposits growth and poor credit growth from the banking system. Right friends, let us look at the second issue, most controversial. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is the king. Here, if you infer the inner meaning, you can interpret it that other countries are not growing satisfactorily. So, India's growth is better than other countries. That means other countries are not able to perform well. Even India is also not able to perform, but our performance is somewhat better than other countries. That is the inference of Raghuram Rajan's sentence. But Raghuram Rajan commented several times that he is having some doubts about the economy, which is growing at 7 to 7.5%. He expressed his doubts several times that the macroeconomic indicators are not supporting the growth statistics, which pegged at around 7 to 7.5%. And if you analyze the reasons, these things will be evident. Whether the economy is really growing at 7 to 7.5%, you can come to the conclusion if you analyze these points. First and the foremost is exports have fallen by 16% in 2015-16, which is a serious matter of concern. And in fact, exports are falling continuously since December 2014. Second important point is, except some isolated months, index of industrial production figures are dismal. Third one is the food grain production touched the peak of 265 million tons in 2013-14. Subsequently, it has fallen by around 4 to 5% and hovering around 250 million tons. Then rural distress is clearly evident due to 2 successive years of drought. Then construction sector, which contributes 9 to 10% of GDP, is witnessing tepid growth in several cities, several metros. The construction sector is not going on the expected lines. And the next point, poor credit offtake from the banking system. Credit offtake is expected to be around 17 to 18%, but it is around 10 to 11%. Next one is investment to GDP ratio. That is one important macroeconomic indicator that has fallen from 38% in 2009-10 to 28% in 2014-15. Capacity utilization of companies is very low, shrinking corporate profits, then fall in gross fixed capital formation. This is another important macroeconomic indicator. Then poor employment figures, and which hit the lowest ever in recent times. So, these macroeconomic indicators are not signaling 7 to 7.5% growth. And in addition to this, Reserve Bank of India will analyze the further points. The first one is two-wheeler sales or car sales growth. Second one is freight loading in railways and ports. demand for consumer goods and their sales are growth. What is the demand for power? Then import of capital goods to determine the real rate of expansion. You may ask, what is the difference between capital goods and consumer goods? Please look into this slide. So these are capital goods. Capital goods are basically used to manufacture products for final use. Then agriculture production and rural demand and classification of monsoon. Then shrinking corporate profits, poor state of public sector banks. So RBI analyzes these things also. So after analyzing macroeconomic indicators and after analyzing the indices by Reserve Bank of India, then anyone can come to the conclusion that our economy is actually in reality not growing at 7 to 7.5%. And RBI governor expressed the viewpoint several times that macroeconomic indicators are not supporting GDP figures. Hence, if you look at it from any perspective, there is a substance in the comment of Reserve Bank of India Governor Raghuram Rajan. Right friends, look at the last one. Africa is suffering because of tumbling commodity prices. What is the reason? The reason is due to non-diversification. African economies, some of the economies are dependent on commodities like iron ore. Then some of the economies are dependent on oil resources, petroleum products, and there is a glut in petroleum products. Prices crashed recently and fall of around 40 to 50% in commodity prices occurred in recent times. So if you look at it from this perspective, the need of the hour for any country is diversification in economy is a must. Now Africa is suffering because of tumbling commodity prices. Let us analyze the economies of South Africa and Nigeria. And if you look at Africa as a whole, during the recent past, imports from Africa to China reduced by 40%. And South Africa and Nigeria are worst affected, and Angola, Ghana, Mozambique, Zambia are also affected due to fall in commodity prices. If you look at specifically South Africa, it is the biggest exporter of iron ore to China and is suffering because of a glut in steel market. What is glut? Glut is nothing but when the supply is more than demand, then prices will crash. That situation is known as glut. There is at present not only glut in steel industry, glut in oil production also. That's why prices crashed not only for steel but also for petroleum products. And currency rand has fallen drastically, and South Africa is facing worst ever drought in a generation, and it is at the threshold of a recession. Because of fall in commodity prices, South Africa is one of the countries worst affected in Africa. If you look at Nigeria, it is also suffering. Africa's biggest economy, Africa's biggest oil producer, 70 to 80% of revenue comes from oil. If you look at Nigeria, it is suffering badly because of a drastic fall in oil prices, and not only that, Boko Haram towards the northeastern part is another problem, right? And if you analyze further points, there is a less diversification in African economies. That is the precise reason why some economies are crumbling because of a fall in commodity prices. As several currencies have weakened in recent past, this posed risk to pay back the loans taken for infrastructure projects. When the currency depreciates, what will happen? Then the burden on the country for paying back the loans will be increased. Then endemic problems of poor infrastructure, both the physical infrastructure and the social infrastructure, along with corruption, are posing serious threats for some African countries, both economically and socially. However, some economies like Kenya and Ethiopia are faring much better due to diversification. So the final word is diversification is essential for economies to face adverse situations arising out of globalization. Right, so suffering of African economies, some of the African economies, is a big lesson for any country in the world. Right friends, let us conclude insight. Please do join for other modules. A nice day. Thank you.